Hello, everyone. My name is April Brown, and I am the Digital Outreach Coordinator for the Archaeological Conservancy. Welcome to our virtual lecture, The Gault Site and the Peopling of the Americas. Our guest speaker this evening is Dr. Clark Warnaghi. Dr. Clark Warnaghi is the Executive Director of the Galt School of Archaeological Research. He began his career with a degree in history from SMU, followed by an MBA from Northwestern University, an MA in anthropology from Florida Atlantic, and a PhD from the University of Texas, Austin. He has worked on archaeological projects across the world and has written extensively on the topics of architecture and Paleo-Indian art. Welcome, Dr. Warnaghi. We're excited to have you here with us this evening.
Oh, well, thanks for having me tonight. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here, and I see a lot of familiar names and faces there on Zoom. So it's good to see some of the folks that actually worked at Galt over the years. Currently, there's what's known as a paradigm shift going on in the archaeology of the first peoples of the Americas. We've disproved old hypotheses, and we're just coming up with new models for testing. And the story we all learned in school, and unfortunately we still teach to fourth graders, is actually a very old one. It started in 1590 when a Jesuit priest named Jose de Acosta wrote the bestseller of the day about his 15 years in the New World, is titled The Natural and Moral History of the Indies. It was a real page turner, believe me. Acosta, he reasoned that the people in the New World were primitive by his standards, and being a priest, he knew that all peoples had died in a great flood, except for some who landed in a big boat on a Central Asian mountaintop. So he reasoned they must have walked here somehow. I didn't blame it all on that. He said, well, he also saw wolves in the New World. And since only an idiot would put a wolf in a boat, they must have walked here somehow. And at the time, that sounded pretty good to most people. So scholars pretty much accepted it. And then we spent the next 400 years refining it. And we said, 13,500 years ago, there's these half-naked men running around Siberia. These are two pretty typical pictures. The one on your left is actually from a Russian publication. They always make the guys look a little Vladimir Putin-esque, big bare-chested guy with a club staring off at somebody. The one on the right's from an American publication, and it's also not unusual for here. We always make them kind of hunched over and hairy. They must be primitive and they must be somewhat ape-like. In this case, the Russians probably got closer to the truth here. Everybody we're going to be talking about tonight is modern human being, Homo sapiens, just like us. Well, we had to give a reason for these half-naked guys running around. So we decided they're chasing mammoths. They must be chasing mammoths. This is my mammoth herd, and they were highly mobile mammoth hunters. That's what we said. And one day they came upon a bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge. And they must have crossed it, I guess, maybe following the mammoths, until they arrived at the edge of the Great Glaciers. We have the Cordilleran Glacier that ran from the mountains to the sea, and the Laurentian Glacier that covered up to 5 million square miles of northern North America, up to 3 miles high. This is one's artist's depiction of what the edge of that would look like. So it's the end of the Wisconsin and Ice Age, and there's a great big glacier in the way. Now, when I was in school, they never really told you about anything next. They just kind of jumped to the next part of the story. But, I had a good imagination growing up. So I kind of depicted, behold, an ice-free corridor. And the Great Glacier split, leaving a 2,000-mile-long ice-free passageway between them. And early immigrants supposedly headed down through this corridor, but they're not the heroes of this story. They're basically some kind of Asian biker gang, and they kill everything they come across until 37 large animal species become extinct. It sounds a little bit silly when I tell it like this. I mean, outside of Charlton Heston and a little sarcasm, that's actually the story that you all got when you were in school. And then, like I said, unfortunately, it's still the one we're telling fourth graders. So let's start over again. Okay. First of all, Siberia is one of the coldest places on Earth. So there's no half-naked men. They're not all men either. That's not a viable population. So they're babies, teenagers, adults, grandma. They're not chasing mammoths. We only have 17 confirmed mammoth kill sites in the Americas, and mammoths don't migrate east-west. There's no land bridge. Instead, there's a continent called Beringia that's 1,600 miles wide. A gap between two melting ice sheets would have a river, then lakes, then swamps, and eventually some dry ground. And finally, we only have evidence for humans killing about 6 of the 37 large animal species. This is my personal favorite down the lower right, the teratorn. It's a carnivorous bird. That means it kills what it eats. And it has a 24-foot wingspan. Think Cessna. And you are all Slim Jims. So what are we saying? Some kind of Asian biker gang with some kind of primitive aircraft weapon killed all the teratorn? And in fact, that also ignores the fact that bird species and insects and mollusks and all kinds of other things are going extinct at the same time. So none of this story makes any sense from start to finish. And then in the 1970s, archaeologists working in southern Chile, near Puerto Montt, Chile, found the site of Monteverde, which dates to at least 14,800 years ago. There's another layer that's 18.5 that I've seen the artifacts from. I don't have a big problem with. And the 33,000-year-old strata, even the guy who dug it doesn't like talking about. But even if you're really conservative and you will only accept the 14,800-year-old dates at Monteverde, that's 1,000 years before we said people walked here, and it's on the other end of this hemisphere. You know, this just doesn't make any sense. And other sites were found that predated 13,500 years ago. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Cactus Hill in Virginia, Miles Point in Delaware. This site, Paisley Cave in Western Oregon, where they found 14,300-year-old coprolites. Now, we're scientists, so we have to have a different word for everything. So if you don't know what a coprolite is, it's a turd. And this is a very old turd. And you can argue about whether this rock or that rock was a tool or not, but a turd's a turd. It's organic, so they can pull dates from it, and they can actually pull DNA from it. And people were using this cave as a bathroom 14,300 years ago. Again, a good 1,000 years before we said they walked here. Last July, one of our colleagues who worked at Galt, Dr. Cyprian Argeline, published in Nature magazine regarding his finds at Chiquihuite Cave in Zacatecas, Mexico, where they have human artifacts with 28,000-year-old dates. And you can see this is pretty painstaking archaeology. They're digging in clean suits, for gosh sakes. More and more sites have been found that support the fact, and it is now a fact, that people were here much earlier than we'd previously thought. This recent graphic from Wikipedia shows many of these sites. It actually includes the Gault Site, which is called Buttermilk Creek on this map. It's a tributary of the Salado River here in Texas. And we appreciate being included in graphics like this, even if they do put the site in the wrong state. I think the people of Texas kind of take offense there. The Gault Site is actually located about 40 miles north of Austin, Texas, just outside the central Texas town of Florence. It's actually been known to collectors, and it's been known to collectors since at least 1904 and to professionals since 1929. The first archaeologist in Texas, Dr. J.E. Pierce, actually worked in this area. The site was subject to both looting and collecting for almost 90 years. And the site's really remarkable for the surprises it held for archaeologists. One of the first surprises were stones like this, with incised designs on them. They were normally hand-sized and smaller. If you've forgotten your metric, we tell all of our volunteers if they put an English measurement on one of our forms, we beat them within 2.54 centimeters of their life. So that scale is about 2 inches. This is pretty small, but if you look, it's got a very ornate design on it. So we find these hand-sized and smaller stones, and the ones that were found in the deepest layers at Galt actually represent the oldest dated art in the Americas. We now have more than 160 of these in the lab, most of them with geometrical patterns. Stones like these are found on every continent except Antarctica, going back as far as 450,000 years ago to pre-human hominids. Many of those geometric designs are actually part of the software, your frontal cortex. It's part of how we store and sort memories. Children about the age of 2 start drawing the same things. So it's pretty cool stuff. And that's a big surprise. Our next big surprise at Galt was just the sheer quantity of material at the Gault site. Over 10 years, the Galt School of Archaeological Research excavated approximately 3% of the site. And we brought 2.6 million artifacts back to the lab to study. A lot of this is debris from what was apparently a very large scale tool manufacturing operation. We got a further surprise at the site when we came upon the lower mandible of a juvenile female Columbian mammoth. Now, that would be a nice find in itself, but it was surrounded by 22 stone butchering tools and a Clovis point. This makes it a probable mammoth kill site, one of only about 17 currently known in the Americas. Test excavations on another part of the site came across a slightly rectangular stone floor. It's about 4 inches thick, made out of gravels from the creek. And that's not too surprising if you don't want to go to sleep and wake up completely soaking wet with the moisture that wicks up through central Texas clay every day. But this floor is surrounded by a non-random scatter of artifacts, including a flint knapping area to the north of it, where someone was manufacturing and resharpening stone tools. There was an area filled with burned flakes that indicates there was a fire somewhere to the east of this. And an area to the southwest where we find quite a lot of animal bone and things like that. It's where their garbage pile was. This data, among other things, indicates that this floor has a front and a back, and therefore a structure on top of it. And the tool technology and the dates from around it tells us this is at least 12,700 years old, and perhaps older, which makes this the oldest excavated house in North America. Not something we thought we'd find when we got out there. The last surprise was a really big one. In 2002, we were winding up some of our excavations and we were going to be leaving the site for a while. And one of our staff, Sam Gardner, pictured here, was cleaning a profile. He's basically following the water table as it dropped during one of Texas's extreme droughts. He'd dig until he hit water. Then we'd wait a couple of days when the water dropped down and he'd dig a little bit more. And at the very bottom of this test unit, he ran into Clovis Age Artifacts. Those we used to think represented the first peoples in the Americas, so 12,700 to 13,500 years ago. And below the Clovis artifacts, he kept finding more stone tools and debris that predated Clovis. So in 2007, after we were able to acquire the site and donate it to the Archaeological Conservancy, our host tonight, we excavated some very quick holes to show visiting archaeologists the geology of the site. One of the largest gatherings of archaeologists in the world, the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting, was going to be in Austin for the very first time ever. I can tell you from sad experience that 5,000 archaeologists on 6th Street in downtown Austin is not a really good idea, but they really liked it. So they were coming and we were going to open up some holes just to show basically the geology of the site to these guys. We again found artifacts, some more than 3 feet, a meter below the Clovis strata. So after the archaeologists left, we raised a very large stress skin building over the area and we began to remove the mixed surface soils. Now, I'm in charge of logistics, among other things. So I had to get this building erected very quickly. And because I did that, we couldn't actually bring in a bobcat or anything and remove the cigarette wrappers and beer cans and rusty tools that we find in the mixed soils. So they handed me a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow and said, go get rid of that stuff. My staff says this is one of the few pictures of me actually working. But we started in the back corner of this area, and we didn't get very far when we started to find intact archaeology again. We actually started excavating a 56 square meter unit. And it was designed to step down and in twice to eventually expose about 12 square meters on the underlying bedrock to see what was there. The stone circles you see here in the foreground are actually 4,000 to 8,000 year old stone ovens that we basically find in central Texas. Curse their inefficiency, the looters and collectors had never dug in most of this area. And I say curse their inefficiency because, of course, I'm interested in stuff at the very bottom of this hole. But if there's intact archaeology, we're responsible for all of it. And the record was held by the unit in the lower left-hand corner of this in a 1 by 1 meter square, 10 centimeters deep level. That's about 4 inches. The two young ladies working in that square found 16,683 artifacts and pieces of debitage. Everything larger than a quarter in the upper levels, we got its position with a laser system. In the lower levels, it's everything larger than a dime. They took all that information and wrote it on a permanent tag with a permanent marker. They read all that information on a bag. They read all that information on their clipboard. They map it on their clipboard. They read all that information on a photographic log. They read all that information on a dry erase board. They go get a North Arrow and a camera, take a picture of the artifact and put it in the bag. 16,000 times. It took those two young ladies 2.5 months to dig 4 inches. It's just that much stuff there. So we finally reached the bottom of that hole in 2013. That's an impressive hole to look at. And it was even more so if you realize that we do microscopic use-wear analysis on the stone tools. That is, we look at the edges of stone tools under a high-powered microscope, and they tell us what material they were used on and in what direction. So we can tell the difference between meat cutting, hide working, hide cutting, hide punching, dry and wet grass cutting, woodworking, bone working. All those things show up differently on the tools. And because the tool making material that people are using here, chert, is stronger than steel, a steel tool leaves a telltale streak of silver across the stone tool if it touches it. So you can't use a mason trowel like we normally use. So most of this hole was dug with bamboo splinters and chopsticks. That makes it a much more impressive hole, I'm sure. Every once in a while, somebody asks, well, why didn't you just increase the size of the hole and dig more? And what part of it took us 8 years to get to the bottom do you not understand? This is the bedrock at the very bottom of that unit. And we did find what we were looking for. We found more than 130,000 tools and the debris from making tools that date between 16 and 20,000 years ago. Even the bedrock here has a story to tell. This Comanche Peak bedrock has grooves in it. You can see some very deep grooves almost going straight up and down there in the lower right, then shallower diagonal ones in the middle. And there's some real shallow ones starting up in the upper left. That actually tells us that at one point, this was the outer bend of Buttermilk Creek. It was cutting outward and up to the left. And people were on the point bar in the middle of that bend of the creek. And they were making tools and they were butchering one of the now extinct horses, Equus scotti. Here you can see horse teeth all in place. The mandible's long gone, but the horse teeth are still there. The Gault Site, which has abundant stone and water resources, as well as readily available foods from a whole number of environments around it, was popular throughout time. There are 22 archaeological cultures you could find on a Central Texas site. And we not only have all 22, but we have a culture even earlier that's not yet named. When we find comparable material to this, maybe one day we'll get to name that culture. I've been arguing for the Clark culture for years. I'm not getting anywhere on that, but we'll see what happens when we find other places. Some of the stone tools left behind by the earliest Texans are very familiar to us, and some are significantly different, as would be expected of a tool style prior to Clovis. The projectile points are unlike anything we've ever seen before. On your left here is a Clovis point from the Gault Site, and on your right are the bases of 3 points found more than 12 feet underground. And they're not very big. You know, you look at that scale, these are about 3/4 of an inch long. The whole point might be an inch long eventually. So, you know, we don't know yet what kind of technology they're using. These are unlike any of the later arrow points we find in Texas. It's a totally different technology. Our archaeological colleagues liked Austin so much, they came around again for a return bout in 2014. They were actually supposed to come back again last year, unfortunately called off due to the pandemic. But in 2014, we hosted busloads of them at the site. And they asked a lot of questions, but most of them seemed pretty satisfied about what they'd seen and heard. And in July of 2018, we actually published this article in Science Advances, one of the premier science publications in the world. You can actually go to our website. There's a link to it. We paid to make it open source, so you can actually read it whether or not you have a subscription. This details the geology, the stratigraphy, and the dating of the Gault site. And it shows that we have human artifacts that are unquestionably 16 to 20,000 years old in Texas. The news of that was actually picked up by electronic and print media throughout the United States, then eventually in Great Britain. I mean, they almost speak the same language, so that doesn't surprise us. And then articles about it were written in magazines, newspapers, and online throughout the world. In fact, there's actually more interest and knowledge about the subject outside the US. One of the first publications that we saw was actually one of the leading newspapers in Santiago, Chile. When Monteverde was found, it was quite controversial. And there were a fair number of people who said, well, I don't know, a site in South America. And that kind of teed the people of Santiago, Chile off. So the newspaper highlighted Galt and Monteverde, and you could sum that article up with, I told you so. So in 2015, we closed up those big excavations at the site. And since then, we've been spending a lot of time in the lab, writing up our findings from this incredible archaeological site. What people always forget about archaeology is for every day in the field, there's perhaps 40 days in the lab to figure out what it means. That's really the important part of archaeology. What does it mean? And currently we have a monograph about the Clovis and older than Clovis components of the site that's going to the publishers this fall. Now, the Gault School of Archaeological Research is a nonprofit, and we're interested in research and education regarding the peopling of the Americas, not the peopling of Texas. So we actually keep busy with a lot of other projects. We've worked on early man sites from Oaxaca, Mexico, a possible mammoth kill site in Guatemala. We searched for underwater sites with NOAA in the Gulf of Mexico, examined a possible bison jump on the Edwards Plateau. We did lithic analysis on an early man site called Huaca Prieta in Peru. And volunteers and Gault School members work on usually about 10 to 15 sites here in Central Texas every year, looking for comparable material to Galt. We need more than one site to be able to define a culture. We also take our educational role very seriously. Archaeology is an apprenticeship discipline, and employers are looking more for what you can do rather than what you know. We have at any one moment more than about 300 volunteers who help with excavation. We had more than 2,300 volunteers work at the Gault site alone. We currently have 13 students and volunteers working in our lab. We have internships. We've worked with students on directed independent study projects, and we've had 16 master's theses and 6 doctoral dissertations come out of the Galt collection alone, and it's not the only thing we're working on. And we're very proud of the fact that our students in this field have gone on to do pretty great things. In the news currently, Dr. Ashley Lemke at the University of Texas, Arlington, working with John O'Shea at the University of Michigan, have been investigating a ridge in mid-Lake Huron that was above water up until 10,000 years ago and was apparently used as a great place to ambush migrating caribou. Among other things, they have an obsidian tool debris that came from a source in Oregon, 2,000 miles away. Ashley is also the current chair of the International Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology. She started with us as a student, and we're very proud of her. One of our other students, Brendan Mash, is also currently in the news. Brendan, currently a PhD student at the University of Michigan, working with Henry Wright and Thomas Talbot, recently discovered the first Clovis site ever found in Michigan. This area was thought to have been glaciated 13,000 years ago, so it's changing our understanding of some of the earliest peoples in the Great Lakes area. If you'd actually like to find out more about our work, we actually have an extensive website at galtschool.org. The Gault School of Archaeological Research is a nonprofit, and we're dependent on grants and memberships and donations from people like you who are both interested in what the past can tell us and wish to participate in our discoveries. Our website actually has more information on how you could join us in this mission. There's also more information on the internet at galtfilm.com. It's an ongoing project to produce a documentary about the Gault site. And there's some really good documentary clips that the people working on that documentary have already put up on there. So with that, I'm going to thank the Conservancy for inviting me tonight and all of you for joining us tonight. And I'm going to try and answer as many questions as I can tonight. I know that there's going to be a lot of questions out there. There always are, and I'm happy to try and answer them.
Okay, I have a few written down. Would you like for me to chat them to you?
Sure, feed them to me.
Okay, feed them to you. So the first one comes from Mary. It says, is the excavation still ongoing? And when did it start?
The excavation at Galt is now no longer ongoing. We have sealed up the excavations there. We have 2.6 million artifacts from 3% of the site. So excavating at Galt would statistically just give me more of the same. We tell people that, yes, there's a slight chance that the Great Jade Monkey Idol might be 5 feet over in one direction, but in Central Texas, that's a very slim chance. The Area 15 excavation is actually the 4 white vinyl posts you see over my right shoulder in the background. That's how we delineate that area today, so people who go on tours there can see it. We do tours of the site. We started excavation at the site. There were test excavations there in 1991, and then we started in 1999. We finally closed up the last of the excavations in 2015. So it's a very long time.
Okay, great. The next question is the site associated with Brushy Creek site?
The Brushy Creek site. No, Brushy Creek is away from us. What it is associated with is 300 yards downstream is something called the Deborah L. Friedkin site. It's one property removed from ours that some of our colleagues from Texas A&M worked on for, I think, 6 or 7 seasons. And they have pretty much the same thing we've got.
Okay, the next question was, who built the scaffolding for the archaeological site? And that's from Christine.
Oh, the walkway and everything, that's all
Yes.
me. I am the one-man maintenance crew. So I do most of the tours at the Gault site. I and one other volunteer built the retaining walls and the walkway around it at the time. Yeah, it was just to facilitate group visits at the time and also to keep people from crumbling the edges of the excavation. So.
Okay, there's a question from Bruce. Were there any caribou remains identified?
No, and far as we know, we don't have any caribou in Texas. There's a little bit of an argument about some elk in West Texas, perhaps in the Pleistocene in the Guadalupe Mountains, but that's a long ways from here. We have horse and mammoth and bison and all the usual suspects. We don't get a lot of the little stuff other than little tiny bits. We have some 20,000 faunal specimens, of which about 5% is actually identifiable to species.
Okay, I'll see here. The next question is, do you think this site dates back before Cahokia?
Yes, it does. And Cahokia's height was about 800 AD. This is 20,000 years ago, so long before Cahokia. Yeah, we have a lot of very organized things. Cahokia is actually one of my favorites. I bring it up to people all the time because most people in the United States don't know anything about it. And unfortunately, most of it is just a state of Illinois park. It's not even a national park. Anywhere else, it'd be a national treasure.
And Greg asks, are there any Galt artifacts available for public viewing at any of the museums?
Right now, there's actually only one. Archaeologists don't do museum exhibits. Those are expensive. Museums borrow stuff for museum exhibits. But one of those little points from deep down in the site is actually in the very first case in the Bullock, Texas State History Museum in downtown Austin, right near the Capitol. They have an exhibit called Becoming Texas. So if you're going to talk about Becoming Texas, you have to start at the beginning. And when you walk in the front doors, directly ahead of you is a very large case with a very small point suspended in the middle of it.
Okay, so the next question is basically what made this area attractive for people to settle? What drew them there?
Or as we put it in Texas, I mean, the first time I got out of a car out there and it was 105, my brain was screaming, why would anyone live here? First of all, we're on the edge of the Edwards Plateau, which is actually where most of the water in Texas comes from. The Edwards Plateau is 34,000 square miles of porous limestone. And it's where the 15 largest springs in Texas are and where 4 of our 6 major rivers start. So a lot of water, that's one reason. It's also what's known as an ecotone. It's where environments transition into one another. So we have the Blackland Prairie, the coastal plains, just a short distance away. We're actually at the conjunction of what's known as the Balcones Canyonlands, the Edwards Plateau proper, and the Blastus Cut Plains. And then our valley that you see behind me here is completely different than everything around it. We tell people it's like living in the alley between 2 grocery stores and Lowe's and Home Depot. You pretty much have everything there. And on top of that, the Edwards Plateau, which is 34,000 square miles of this porous limestone, is one of the largest sources of chert in North America. We find Edwards Plateau chert more than 1,500 miles away archaeologically. So they've got all this wonderful tool making material as well. So they have material, they have water, they have food. That's why people are coming here.
Okay, the next question's kind of related. Someone wants to know how you think they got there.
How did they get here? Well, they couldn't have walked here. That's the problem. I noted, jumping ahead, that somebody had commented about there's an article that was released today about a site in White Sands that has 23,000-year-old human footprints and extinct animals. We know people are here a lot earlier. And if they're down in Texas and New Mexico, then they had to have gotten here probably around 30,000 years ago. So no way to walk here then. They have come along the Atlantic, the Pacific, or both coasts. Now, I know people really like the Pacific coast, but there's also a good chance that the little bit of genetics we have doesn't tell us all of the truth, because we're not sure we could tell the difference between people living in Asia and people living in what was Europe, what's Europe now. And the Europeans had nothing to do with this because the population of Europe's been replaced 3 times in the last 14,000 years. We're not sure who was there. There's some recent genetics was done on some of the oldest bodies in Europe that says that they have a lot of affinities way to the east as well as to the west of them. So we're not sure. Maybe it's both. We have a number of sites along the East Coast. We don't have very many human remains to look at, maybe 19 older than 9,000 years old, the oldest of which are a good 15,000 years short of where we need them to be. Most of those, oddly enough, are west of the Mississippi if you drew a line through this hemisphere. So we have, some genetic material to the west and lots of sites to the east. And what we need is some genetic material to the east and lots more sites to the west. So this is one of those things that archaeologists usually end every one of their talks with much more work needs to be done. And that's because, yeah, you need a lot more data. Trying to make big suppositions off of just Galt wouldn't do it. You need more.
Okay, the next question would be, what kinds of paleo botanicals that were recovered from the lower levels?
Oh, nothing. Our soil even eats pollen and phytoliths. We have got a few very broken starch grains, and that's about it. Now I have a new project that's ongoing. It won't be in the monograph. It'll be much later, but I'm working with some soil people who think that there might be some other ways to approach that, and maybe they can find more data. I think most interesting thing we've seen so far is we actually saw some grains from the American chestnut. And if you look online at where the American chestnut tree is thought to have grown in the past, the closest it gets to us is way to the east of here. So that tells us something about the environment here that we didn't know before. There's definitely a lot more going on here than we thought. And some of these things that we thought, like that the American chestnut had ever gotten near here, it had to have gotten pretty darn close. Yeah.
Okay, let's see here. We have another question. How do we know that pre-Clovis is even a thing and not stone workings by less than gifted individuals within Clovis?
Well, first of all, we have associated dates, and we know that these materials did not move down for the soil. We have multiple ways to prove that. You could read our Science Advances article. It'll show you why. So the stuff's not moving down below that, and it's below Clovis, and it has really good dates associated with it. So it's much older than Clovis. It also isn't crude. There's nothing crude about this stuff. Old does not mean primitive. Sometimes it's really nice stuff. Sometimes it's really primitive. Not everybody can flint knap. So, just because one item might look cruder doesn't make it older. But generally speaking, the stuff we have below Clovis is not any cruder than Clovis. It's different. Some of the blade technologies are similar. They're doing some slight differences. Their bifacial technologies are completely different. And we don't look at just what things look like. We look at how they're made flake by flake. And we actually sometimes replicate that. We have experimental archaeologists that try to make those tools, and they aren't actually trying to make the tool. They're trying to make the debris we found archaeologically from making that tool. If we have the same kind of debris, then we know we're going about it pretty much the same way. And that's what we're trying to see. And there's some huge differences in technology. We really don't like saying pre-Clovis. And the reason we don't is because there's nothing important about Clovis. And pre-Clovis implies that Clovis is some kind of major event and that anything before that must be pre-Clovis. Might as well be pre-archaic or something like that. We usually talk about the American Paleolithic, and we're looking at quite possibly an American Paleolithic, just like we find in a Paleolithic in the Old World. Good questions. Seeing all kinds of little comments on the chat thing too.
Oh, you have so many questions.
And I'm cheering for whoever wrote the thing on Aztalan, because I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I went to Aztalan every year as a kid. So yes, Cahokia outlier.
Okay, so we have a bunch here. Let's see here. I'm trying to get through some of the most recent.
There's a lot of them.
Where in North America have the oldest human remains been found?
Actually, not in North America. The oldest ones right now are from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. In America, I would think the oldest one is probably the Anzac burial from Montana. And that's about 11,000 years old. We have 3 here in Texas. We have the Horn Rock Shelter burials, and we have the very unfortunately named Leanne from the Wilson Leonard site. I say unfortunate because they named it after the nearby town Leander, but people call me all the time and ask me about the Leanderthal. We don't have Leanderthal. They're all modern human beings. Leanne was just named after a town.
Okay, here's one that, let's see, how does the Archaeological Conservancy assist you with your research?
Well, we administer and maintain the site for them, and they've pretty much given us a free hand as the people that help them get the site, which we've been very grateful for. We were able to do all the research we wanted to do. Nowadays, we have monthly scheduled tours of Galt, and we do tours for any group of 10 or more. We do a lot of school tours and everything. About 8,000 people a year come through the site. It's a lot of fun, but we're basically using the site now as an educational tool.
Okay, so someone asked, can you tell us more about what you've learned about the people who came to Galt, how they lived, where they were at before, etc.?
Well, I can't really tell where they were at before because I don't have the people themselves. I mean, we're looking at their garbage. And unfortunately, most of their garbage is long since rotted away. So what I get is primarily stone tools and a little bits and pieces of fauna and things like that. But the most important thing is they're not highly migratory big game hunters. They had the big elephant count 2 years ago. I don't know for anybody who pays attention to that. They determined that we kill about 66,000 elephants a year today. Somehow I don't think 17, or even if you go and maybe 60 other sites that have evidence of mammoth, that these people killed them all. They didn't kill elephants very often. Elephants, by the way, are among the 5 most dangerous animals in the world to hunt today. These people are broad spectrum hunters and gatherers. They don't cross our creek and say, huh, look at that turtle. What a shame I only eat mammoth. You know, that would be stupid. They eat everything. They eat the nuts, they eat the berries, they eat rabbits, they eat turkeys, they eat deer. And Galt is a really great place for that because there's all these different resources. And yeah, occasionally they'll eat bison or horse or mammoth, but more often than not, they're eating turtle. There are lots and lots and lots of Clovis sites with turtle on them, far more Clovis sites with turtle on them than there are mammoth. And we know for a fact that it looks really stupid because our graphic artist in our office actually put together a slide for a PowerPoint for me of 15 half-naked guys poking a turtle. We made the turtle look really mean, but it does look stupid. So we still portray them as 15 half-naked guys poking a mammoth. Here in Texas, it's always a woolly mammoth, a critter we never even had here. So yeah, broad spectrum hunters and gatherers. And, you know, things like that floor tells us that they're not picking up and moving every day. Nobody's kicking the teenagers awake and going, come on, you know, we got to go. We got to be in Chile in less than 1,000 years. Let's go. You know, if you find a place that's got water and food and all the resources you could want, tool making material, you stay. These people are not highly migratory. They might move seasonally and around the area a little bit, but there's absolutely no reason for them to pick up and move. So those are the big things we're learning. Yeah, quite a different thing than what you learned as a kid. You know, it's not these people that are just going, well, I guess we got to go because the herd moved on, you know. No. If the mammoths moved on, who cares? We're surrounded by deer and turkeys and rabbits and turtles and fish and crawfish and, you know, mussels and pecans and black walnuts and bur oak acorns. Why not? Eat it all.
And there's several questions, and you may have touched on it. I'm sorry if I missed it. I'm reading questions. People want to know.
I'm just laughing as I see them come up on the chats.
Good. People want to know what the climate was like that long ago, 14, 15,000 years ago.
It depends on the week. So climate is worldwide, weather is local. We deal on a site like this really with weather, not climate. We want to know what's going on in Central Texas. And sometimes it was wet and sometimes it was dry. Sometimes it was cold. Sometimes it was warm. The Central Texas curves are mostly based on speleothems, stalactites and stalagmites, as well as bog cores. It's not as finely delineated as we would like it. It's one of the projects that a lot of people here would like to do in the future. But for instance, even when we're looking at, say, the period that you find the Clovis culture in, at the end of that, we have a drought that's coming into play here in Texas. And we have out at the site in one place, a Clovis Age well, where people are digging down near where a spring usually is, following that water table down to get the water. So you can actually see that in the archaeology. The earliest peoples there in that period were using the spring. As the spring disappeared, they followed it. The most interesting thing in that area is the lower stuff in that Clovis strata have horse and bison and mammoths, and the upper stuff only has bison. I'm not sure if that means that people using that technology in this area spanned perhaps localized extinction. Maybe the mammoths and the horses were disappearing. I don't know, but it is unusual. It also tells you something about environment. They all need different kinds of environments to live in. Good questions out there.
Let's see. Another question, could you comment on the Solutrean hypothesis for the peopling of the Americas? Has that been rejected at this point in time?
Well, to reject a hypothesis, you actually have to test it. Something I keep reminding some of my colleagues. You don't just reject it because you don't like it. That's not how science works. And one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like it, and it pops up on the internet all the time, is people say it's a racist thing. Because neo-Nazis jumped all over it and said, oh, white people were here first when they first saw it. Of course, what we do know is genetically, there are no white people till 9,000 years ago. So we're not talking about white people. They did the genetics on Cheddar Man, one of the earliest bodies found in England. And much to a lot of people's dismay, they found out, guess what? He's dark-skinned. We don't know who lived in Europe. And unfortunately, we've never found a body from the Solutrean period. They either didn't bury people or burn them, or at least not where we've been able to find them. And as I said, the population of Europe's been replaced 3 times. So it's not a racist hypothesis. The interesting thing is people keep focusing on one tiny little thing or this other little tiny thing. The hypothesis, and it's an old one actually, it's just been renewed. And when Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford wrote about it in Across Atlantic Ice, they were just bringing this back up. And Bruce in particular is a lithic analyst and has worked a lot with Solutrean lithics. And there are a lot of similarities between some of the lithic technologies and what we see in the New World. Now, that doesn't mean that people couldn't have developed them differently, but what people say is, well, they didn't come across the stormy North Atlantic, which usually tells me somewhere at home they have a Titanic DVD and they've watched it way too many times. Because, you know, even the modern Inuit, you know, they sail on the ocean in umiaks, fairly large boats. I have a picture from the 1800s of an umiak that has 8 tons of cargo and 12 people in it. This is a skin and bone boat that has no archaeological signature. If a storm comes up, you pull it out on the ice and get underneath it. If an iceberg shows up, you either go around it or you get off on it and get some water. There's just no real problem on either side, the Atlantic or the Pacific. And the genetics we have right now aren't enough to tell us what happened, because you're comparing old stuff with new stuff. And if you get your genetics done, it doesn't tell you where your neighbor's from. So getting the genetics of, say, the Anzac child in the center, you know, in the central part of the United States does not tell us where everybody's from. It tells us something about that person. That's not statistical, it's not science. And as I said, we have an unusually large number of sites that are showing up on the East Coast where we don't have any genetic material. So we're curious about that, and we need to test it. You know, there have been more than 60 solo crossings of the Atlantic in the 20th century alone. Some of them in rowboats, and not all of them on purpose. It's not that hard to get across. It's not that hard to get across the Pacific if you're going along the land and bouncing from refugia to refugia. Same thing along the Atlantic. So it's perfectly easy to do both. There's a lot of food along both. Those ice fronts, as that ice melts, all the minerals from that go into the water. You get all kinds of, you know, microscopic plant materials, and then all the animals come for that. On the Atlantic, you had great auks and seals. You have the same kind of thing on the Pacific side. So there's plenty of food for people too. We need a lot more information before we reject a hypothesis. It is an idea. It is not a fact. It is not anything else. It's simply an idea saying, hey, there's some really odd stuff going on here, and maybe we should check that. So, you know, researchers like us, we don't reject scientific hypotheses just out of hand. You try and figure out how could we test that and what would we look for? And we're looking for more sites, more information, and maybe it'll shake out eventually. That's the long answer, because you know Solutrean's going to come up eventually. Yep.
So I see a lot of questions that are asking about human remains, and I wondered if you might touch on, you know, why it's challenging to find human remains that old, and just why you just don't find them. And there are people asking why you know, if you could do GPR to find them, or you know, had you found any?
Unfortunately, first of all, we're very fragile. In fact, you remember that horse mandible I showed you? Oh, wait, there was no mandible. There were just teeth. Yeah. Even in Central Texas, J.E. Pierce was one of the first to work at the Gault Site in 1929. And he found two burials somewhere over my left shoulder, over that way. Yeah, I can't even do it here, but they're less than 1,000 years old, and they both fit in tiny little white boxes about half the size of a shoebox. Human remains do not last long in most circumstances. Things that stay wet stay preserved. Things that stay dry stay preserved. So you get things like the Horn Rock Shelter burials. Well, they were in a dry rock shelter. That's why they lasted that long. Leanne at the Wilson Leonard site was way down deep near the water table and probably was wet most of the time. At Galt, we've got a surface water table that varies all over the place, and it gets wet and dry. And that's why we don't have even pollen and phytoliths. Everything out there just gets eaten by the soil. And in a lot of places, that's the case. And in some places, finding those old soils where somebody might be buried just might be beyond our reach. You know, if you were looking for Pleistocene soils, say in lower Louisiana, it's about 150 feet down. The Mississippi's been carrying a lot of silt all these years. And so we don't have the ability to do that. If you're looking for peoples who perhaps came along the seashore, in Texas, that's 108 miles out from Galveston. If you look at, that's all that continental shelf. There's a very wide one here in the Gulf of Mexico, and a really wide one on the East Coast. It's why there are a lot of researchers working along the West Coast. There's a very narrow continental shelf there. There's a better chance that we might find something above water. The project we did with NOAA, you know, the ship alone is about $24,000 a day. It's hard to find that kind of money to go looking for the needle in a haystack. In fact, that project, they said they found the haystack. Now all they have to do is find the needle. Not the same thing.
Okay, we'll just take a few more because we're getting closer to 6 o'clock, and there's just so many. But I'm trying to kind of pick and choose here. Let's see here. There's been a couple of questions that are related. One is, are there other sites kind of similar to the Gault site in Texas? And are there efforts to look at associated settlement patterns outside of the Gault complex? So they're kind of similar.
Well, yeah, I mean, we test about 10 to 15 sites here in Texas looking for similar geology, similar stratigraphy, similar dates, similar artifacts. The unfortunate part is the end result is you have to kiss a lot of frogs. You can do all kinds of ways to narrow down where you dig, but eventually you got to dig a hole. And when you get to that bottom of the hole, 99 out of 100 times, there's nothing at the bottom of the hole. Or, you know, it peters out 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. So it's going to take a lot of looking. There really aren't other sites like this in Texas, with the exception of the Deborah L. Friedkin site. And they'll tear their hairs out when I say this, but it's 300 yards downstream. It's actually part of all one big site. There's a property in between us that has artifacts on it too. So you can't really use that as a comparison. They're too close together. They're basically the same thing. So that's why we need to find other sites here in Central Texas. Unfortunately, archaeologists have long suspected that if you were going to look at this statistically, less than 1% of these sites probably still exist. Most of them would have gotten destroyed even within their lifetime. And of that 1%, I need to find ones that are deeply buried. They need to be covered sites, you know, in situ. And that really narrows it as to what you're looking for. So it's a lot to look at. There was another famous writer, I won't mention his name because he's an idiot, but he wrote an editorial a couple of years ago, said there is no such thing as pre-Clovis. And his reasoning was because if there was, we would have found it by now. So in 1806, Meriwether Lewis found Clovis Points at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky. You can go see them today. They're in a museum in Cincinnati. We didn't define the Clovis culture till the 1940s. We have to find this stuff in place, in context. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. We may have been looking at older than Clovis stuff our entire lives, but if it's eroded out and it's on the surface, we don't know what it is. You know, we have no way of dating it. We have no way of associating it with the rest of that information. So finding those other sites, and we're not alone. There's a good 70 researchers with a dog in the hunt. We had them all here to Austin one year for a conference. Most of us talk to each other all the time. We're looking in different parts of the country and looking in different ways. Unfortunately, things like, you know, somebody mentioned GPR before. There's no real way to spot archaeological remains underground. Ground penetrating radar and things like that works really well for things like house foundations, but it doesn't work well for stone tools. It's just one more rock. There's no way to tell until you dig it up. So there's no way we can do this without digging holes. And, you know, we get people that bring us a shoebox full of stuff, and there might be something that piques our attention. We might do a surface survey. We'll go out to somebody's ranch and we'll look for erosion features like ravines, things like that, that would give us a clue of what might be underground. But then you have to dig a hole. Yeah, it's a long process. Like I said, there's actually people out starting on Saturday working on a bunch of holes on another ranch. Saturday and Sunday, we have a whole bunch of our volunteers digging on a site they really hope will find at least Clovis. We'll see. I hope for their sakes they do.
Okay. One of the questions that I've seen repeated is, what were some of the tools made out of? Could you source them from where they came from?
They're made out of chert. Flint, by the way, is a type of chert that's formed in chalk. We don't really have flint, we have chert. Opal, jasper, chalcedony are also cryptocrystalline silicates. They're in the same family. Here at the Edwards Plateau, and Galt is on the edge of Edwards Plateau, we have this massive source of chert. So it outcrops all over at Galt. All the ravines here are filled with kind of pre-tested chert that's banged around in floods. There's just chert laying everywhere. We said, you know, you could tell the volunteers from the professionals at the site immediately out of all the people that work there, because the avocational archaeologists and volunteers would walk about 10 feet from their car, pick up the first thing they saw on the ground and go, "Oh my God, is this an artifact? I just found this right here." And they'd get all excited. And the professionals take about 10-foot walk, look down at the ground and go, "Ah, crap, artifacts." Because we know how much paperwork's involved. And if the surface is covered, it's a lot of stuff. So almost all of the material at Galt is local. It's from right here. In fact, the only real exotic we ever found at Galt was one of the first finds out there. It was an Alabates Clovis Point. Alabates chert comes from Alabates National Monument, which is just north of Amarillo, about 400 miles away from Galt. So that was really interesting, but not much. For the most part, the chert is leaving here. We tell people on tours that if they see chert in their backyards, which here in Central Texas, a lot of people have balls of it everywhere, it's annoying. We tell them it's worth $3.50 a pound on eBay and Craigslist, because modern flint knappers still want Edwards chert, and the post office was stupid enough to give you a set rate box. So there's your new eBay business. And there are people here that sell it to flint knappers all over the world. So people are still trading it. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why people are coming here. Just a huge source of tool making material.
So for the final question, we're going to circle back around. Someone's question was, so back to your introduction, what is the story we should be telling about the peopling of Americas?
Well, the story we know now, first of all, is we don't know it all. You know, rather than, we shouldn't be telling kids K through 12 that, oh, this is what happened. We aren't quite sure exactly what happened, but we do know people are here a lot earlier. They're probably here about 30,000 years ago. They could not have walked here then, though lots of people later did walk here, and a whole mess of animals walked here. And some things went back to Siberia the other way once you could do that. So there were things going back and forth later, but the first peoples who came here couldn't have walked here. They had to come along the Atlantic, the Pacific, or both coasts in boats. That's the story we got right now. So we don't know what date, we don't know where they came from, or if they all came from the same place. There's a lot of things we don't know. What we do know is everything we thought we knew is wrong. All that stuff that started with Jose de Acosta saying, hey, they must have walked here, doesn't work. It just doesn't fit any of the data we have.
Well, that was an amazing presentation.
Yay.
Thank you so much for coming and doing this for us. I think everyone really enjoyed it. So everyone, the recorded version will be on our YouTube channel, and it's already probably going to be on Facebook because we've been live streaming in just a few minutes. So if you want to rewatch it, it'll be there. So
You can rewatch
thank you
it.
guys.
And
Yeah, people have been talking about it. Yeah,
again.
everybody
So
loved it.
you have trouble going to sleep tonight, it'll be available.
But thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. And we're having another lecture on October 7th. So be sure to go to our website. Have a good night.
Thanks, guys.